Okay, so I apologize for the delay. Sometimes you try to get something new to work and you're playing around with it and whatever, and it fails miserably, so you just scrap it. We'll try it next time. So today we're going to talk about structure and organization in the world of graphic design, specifically related to a lot of the terminology and how do we actually organize the content that goes into these graphic design pieces, whether it's a poster or a book or whatever. How do we establish the right kind of layout? And what tools do we use to do that? So we'll start with the basic grid systems, and then we'll move into alternative grids a little bit later. The challenge with alternative grids is they're so intuitive that it's difficult to teach you how to do it. And a lot of times it's much easier to just start with grids, and then maybe we break the grids occasionally in the process. So when we start talking about grids, we have to go through a definition of terms. And you've seen through a variety of my lectures that generally I start with this kind of what's our vocabulary that we're going to be working with so that we have something to base our work on. A lot of these you already know or are familiar with, but it still doesn't hurt for me to go through them again anyway. So we'll start with margins, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's kind of the most basic building block of the world of graphic design. And basically what a margin does is it functions to define the active area of a particular page. So if we have, say, our English paper, the margins that go around our English paper define, hey, this is where the content is, this is where the superfluous stuff is, or basically focusing our direction. Maybe inside of those margins we might have a little header that goes up at the top with your name and the page number. Maybe we have some footnotes that occur down at the bottom. But the active content, the important stuff, your paper, is inside of those margins. And so it's functioning to direct you to the important content. It's going to vary greatly in size based on whatever format you have. If you're doing something on an 11 by 17 with no borders, that's very different than an 8.5 by 11 English paper with big borders. So you're going to kind of vary it based on what the intended purpose would be. And like I said, sometimes it contains other stuff, little extra information, but it's never the primary content. So if we were looking at kind of the graphic example here of what the borders of this particular page would represent, this, by the way, is an image out of the layout workbook by Kristen Cullen, which was one of the recommended books for this class. You may or may not have purchased it, but in this particular section, it's very valuable. It's not really something that works for the whole class, but if you're struggling with your portfolio, or and obviously you haven't started on your portfolio yet, but with this kind of basic elements of graphic design, then this book might be a really handy thing to have. If you want to take a look at it, I have it in my office. I can bring it over and you can see it. So these images are out of that, but the margins are basically all of this stuff that's highlighted in blue that go around the page. Right? They're the frame for the page. If we move on into columns, again, probably something that you're very familiar with. If you've ever read a magazine or a newspaper, those are generally divided into columns. They're vertical divisions of space that are used to align visual elements. So we may have just a single column on a page, i.e. your English paper or your history paper. We may have multiple columns on a page. A magazine, for example, might have up to 4 columns on a page. And it's shorter line length, so it can make a particular thing easier and quicker to read. Okay? It might divide the page into multiple elements, depending on how many columns you have. And the widths are going to vary according to what your function is in the design. Right? What kind of content are you trying to disclose? So if we look at the graphic example, no surprise, these are the columns. Right? In this particular page, there's 4 different columns that can then have content within them. Column intervals, or in some frames, it's called gutter widths. Either one are interchangeable. I'll try to call them column intervals, but I may make a mistake and call them gutter widths. It depends. Basically, it's the space that's in between the columns. So we need to have these little gutter widths, right? This space here, so that these two text blocks don't run together. If we didn't have the column interval or the gutter width, right, it would be hard to distinguish where one line ends and where the next line starts. So we need just a little bit of space, a little bit of breathing room, so that we don't have a collision of elements. And this is something that ends up being very, very important as part of your graphic design, is how wide should these little intervals be, and what feels right in terms of space, breathability, readability, legibility, etc. So highlighted in blue there are the column intervals, right? The space between the columns. Flow lines are kind of like a column interval, except they go in the opposite direction. So flow lines go horizontally across the page, and they divide content, right? And so sometimes seeing it in graphic format is the easiest way to see this. The flow line is this line that goes across here. So we have columns. There's a column interval in between those two columns, right? Likewise, we have column here, negative space column here, third column here. So this is essentially a 3-column layout in this particular context. The flow line is the break that goes across horizontally. So they complement the columns by breaking them horizontally. So we don't just have the vertical set of columns. So our flow line there is highlighted in red. The flow line doesn't have to appear at the top of the page. It doesn't have to appear at the bottom of the page. It could be in the middle. Depends on what you're trying to lay out. One of the nice strategies is to use it at the rule of thirds, right? It's a good place to put it. So just because we talked about composition in relation to photographs and Photoshop doesn't mean that it's still not a valid strategy when it comes to graphic design. Okay? Grid modules are essentially the combination of all of these things coming together. Come on in. It's a combination of all the things coming together. So if we take the columns plus the column intervals plus the flow lines, we end up with little grid squares, so to speak. And so you can see them highlighted up here. I'm not going to highlight them all because if I highlighted them all, they would look like just columns, right? But the idea is that each one of these spaces that is defined by a flow line, a column interval, and or a margin becomes a grid module, right? So that little square is something that we can work with or we can place content into. So in its most basic sense, in a graphic design context here, we have a 3-column layout, 1, 2, and 3. We have each of these grid modules that is being filled with a particular content. This piece of text spans both columns, right? So even though this is a 2-column layout, they're breaking the grid, so to speak, by putting this in a way that spans both columns. Similar thing happening over here. This is spanning. Recognize that this is a 3rd column here, even though it doesn't really have anything in it. So just because you have only 2 active columns doesn't mean that your layout isn't 3 columns. So don't be afraid to leave a column blank, for example. So when we work with our basic grids, the idea behind it is to unify and order the compositional space. So if we have some kind of a background grid behind what we're trying to do, there is some innate organization strategy to how we lay out our work, right? It's not just, let me just slap on a bunch of stuff on the page and see what happens. There is some structure to it. And generally speaking, if you follow some kind of a structure, your end design is going to end up being pretty good, right? And you've probably kind of experienced this a bit when you've been working on your posters for 121 or for 120. Some of the posters turned out really nice. Some of them didn't. The ones that turned out nice probably had some background structure of kind of a grid and a flow line kind of naturally occurring. Okay? We're going to try to beef up your skills such that you always have these kinds of elements and then your posters always look good, right? As opposed to it being the accident. The underlying structure doesn't have to hit you over the head, right? So obviously if we go back a slide to this one, the underlying structure is very apparent. It's obvious that we're breaking it up into these squares. It doesn't have to be this obvious. If we go back yet a few more into something like this, this particular page is not obvious where the grid structure is, but it is still definitely there. Okay? We can still, if we really digest this, we can still see that there are 3 columns on the page. But these elements that span the columns kind of break it down a little bit and make it not quite so apparent in the graphic design sense. And so that can be a good thing. So I guess what I'm saying in summary, sorry, I can't, is that, I went back too far. But I have to let it play its little, is that this doesn't necessarily make it good graphic design just because you used all the little squares. right? Sometimes the other option where you have things that break it and span it within the basic context of the grid, sometimes that's the better strategy for how it really works. You want to avoid just slapping a grid on the page because you need a grid. You want to think carefully about what kind of a grid is appropriate for the content that I'm creating, right? What is the longest line of text that I want to show? How large are my images? How much space do I need for those images? And design the grid based on that information. Design the grid based on the page size, right? How large is the page? How many elements should I really have on this particular page? So functions of grids, this is one of those lists that if we sat down, you could all come up with pretty much everything that's on this list. You know, it's control, organization, rhythm, right? Unity, readability, that kind of thing. Okay, so it's basically organization more than anything else. We can start with just a single column grid. And so in the context of a single column grid, this is perfect for your history paper or your English paper. Large amount of text, right? Not a lot of images, not a lot of extra content with subcaptions and that sort of thing, right? There's a reason that when you turn in your history paper, it's expected to be in kind of a certain format, right? One of the great things about thesis, when you get down the road and you have to do a thesis, is all the people who write thesis for history or whatever as part of their major, it's all the generic, it shows up as a book, and you go into the library and you can see everybody's thesis. It's 8.5 by 11 bound with big text. You go look at the architecture thesis, and I would say at least half, maybe more than half, turn it sideways and put columns in and change the format of the thesis to a great degree. And so that's one of the things that we like to do as designers. We like to play around with this, and you'll probably do this in some of your history papers. But the truth is, if you have a lot of text that you're trying to get through, sometimes the easiest way of formatting that is to have just a single column, right? The space is then defined by the margins. So the larger your margins, the smaller your text. The larger your text, the smaller the margins. Generally, the margins need some adjustments. If we look at this example here, which would be kind of a book layout, you can do this in one of your own books. Generally speaking, there are some rules. The sides and the bottom tend to be large. The top tends to be a little bit smaller in a book. That's just kind of the way it lays out. The inner margin is typically half the width of the outer margin. So we have a little bit more space on the outside of the page, right? The positions are mirrored across a spread. So in this instance here, and I should put a frame around this so you can see where the outside edge of the page would be. But if we're looking at this, right, this space here is the same as this space here. The width of the text here is the width of the text here. Right? So the top is the same, the bottom is the same. So we're mirroring them across the spread. If you were to open a book, chances are that's the general layout. So this is a great kind of infographic about how to establish a really nice grid system layout and where certain content should appear on a page. I'm going to walk you through this example live in InDesign and kind of set it up for you as a way of showing you how to divide up the page and get started with something like this. The other option is you can go online and you can look for InDesign templates. There's a bunch of grid system templates that you can actually load up in InDesign and begin your work from. The truth is you guys are all designers anyway, so chances are you can come up with your own strategy. This is just kind of a nice way of establishing some basic content. And I'll show you how I would go about creating this in the first place. So there is one magic number that you may or may not know. This number will get you what the golden ratio is, which is really, really nice. You guys in 130, how many people have taken 130? Few of you, not enough of you. You guys remember the golden section, right? The square with the rectangle and the little spiral that goes through it, right? So this number, right, has a lot to do with that golden section in that we can take a length and we can divide it to get the division of that in the golden ratio, which is 1.68 to 1 or something like that. And so this number, if we do it, will get us to that number. We'll come back to that. So just remember 0.618 and help me remember it because I always have to look it up because I never remember it off the top of my head. So multiple column grids contain several spatial intervals, and basically as soon as you add more columns, you have nearly endless possibilities for how you organize your work. right? This can be very, very suitable for big, complex projects. It can create a lot of movement, drama on a page, depending on where you place certain content. So I'm showing you, because we're doing a lecture series poster for this class, I'm going to show you a bunch of lecture series type posters so that you can see examples of how people have done it in the past. So in this particular example here, right, how many columns do I have? 4, right? I have 4. I have 3 columns of text, but this still represents 1 column. Okay, so this layout is a 4-column layout. We have nice column intervals here and here, right? What is this? Flow line, maybe, right? So that is a nice flow line. It provides a division, right, across these 4 columns, right? One of the nice things about this is it allows us to create a starting point for where we're viewing this particular poster, right? So in this context, right here is the place that when you initially look at it, that's where you start. And you say, oh, wait, this is a lecture series. Oh, okay, this is some more information about the lecture series. Oh, here's additional information. So we have a place to begin, and then if we follow through with the hierarchy, there's certain ways that they've highlighted dates, etc. We know, oh, this is a date. Oh, this is who's speaking, because of that nice established hierarchy. Modular grids are extensions of the multiple column grids, which last time we were talking about columns, and if we go back one, sorry, push the wrong button. Here, we don't really have this divided up into the grid modules, right? There's not really a square and a square and a square. This is really just 3 columns of text, and they're kind of varied because the number of lectures in a given month vary, etc. So it's not fitting into those programmatic little squares. But we can extend it further with these kinds of programmatic little squares. We saw that example a little bit before. The other thing that we can do, though, is we can span multiple squares. So something might not fall within just 1 column. It might go across multiple columns, which really adds to it. If we define how large our little modules should be, we have to think about 2 things. One, what is the line length of a paragraph? Right? How long is the line of text that I want to be able to read? Okay, so this depends on how close you are to a particular object and how large the font is. So if I were to write in 12-point font, right? You guys are familiar with 12-point font, your English font, and I started right here on the board and I wrote a line that went all the way to the other end of the board, that would be really, really hard to read, right? Because I'd have to be close enough to be able to read it because it's small, and I'd have to be reading and going along like this just to be able to read the length. I couldn't read the whole thing at once. So the line length of that particular paragraph would be too long, right? If, on the other hand, I had a paragraph that was really small and I had 1 word on each line, it would also be difficult to read because I'd be reading kind of down in a row rather than a nice sentence length. So you want to think about what is a nice length of line as it has to relate to your font size and your text size and what you're trying to write. So it shouldn't be too long and it shouldn't be too short. The other thing when you're determining a particular module size is what is the smallest photograph that you want to show. Right? In that example here, right, the photographs are pretty small. They're little square photographs. They're pretty small. That might be too small to show what I want. And one of the challenges when you guys do your portfolios is how do you show enough of your content and then still fit everything that you want on a page. And so for this class, it's not too hard, but let's say you take 121, and you have to do a page on your Mondrian Museum. Well, you have drawings, you have your model, you have several different photographs of your model, maybe you have a detail that you drew. How do you fit all of that on a page? What's more important, what's less important? The natural tendency is I have to have everything on the page. But if everything's on the page, it's all really tiny. You can't necessarily see it. So maybe you have 1 image that's big and you have a few images that are small. It depends on your strategy. But you have to think about what is the smallest size that I'm willing to see. So some examples of how much content can fit on a particular page. Right? We can start with the upper row, which is the large image strategy. Right? We have 1 big image on a particular page. Maybe we have 2 images, but they're big. This would work well for, say, your assignment 101, You have one photograph. Maybe you have the original photograph and the post-process photograph. So maybe it's 2 photos. So in this context, something up at the top on one of those big image formats would be pretty good. Okay? If we move forward and say, do your assignment 106, where we do a bunch of collage work in SketchUp, you're going to have at least 3, maybe 4, maybe more images for that. Therefore, we're looking down here at the smaller images or the medium images. And so if we look in the medium section, maybe you have one image that's really good, you make it big, and you have a couple images that are smaller that kind of supplement and support that one big image. Right? If we start to get down into here, where there's just lots and lots of little small images, we don't necessarily see all the detail that you might like to see in those images. So there's a sacrifice for that. But again, you get more content. So when we get into this modular grid system, we have a lot of compositional flexibility. Right? They need to be flexible enough to accommodate multiple types or multiple outputs or multiple things. So this is part of why I love the portfolio as a final assignment for this class, because you create a lot of different things. Right? The first exercise is a photograph. The second exercise is some kind of excuse me, the first assignment is your best photograph. The second assignment is some kind of a collage in Photoshop, which is similar in size to the photo. The third assignment you guys are doing right now, and that's the poster. It's 11 by 17. Well, that's a very different size and format than the photos that you took. So when it comes to putting it in a portfolio, it's more challenging, because now you have things that are different sizes. Right? The next one after this will be a Charlie Harper drawing. Well, that drawing is, again, very different in size than either of the other 2. And then we'll move forward, and you have multiple items. When we get into AutoCAD and SketchUp, those kinds of things, those will be yet again different. And so as you start to assimilate those various pieces, you have to figure out how they fit into a context and a theme that is your portfolio. And that's part of the really good challenge to something like this. So we can move into the realm of alternative grids. These are the loose organic styles to how you're putting things together. They're very heavy on intuitive. We talked a lot about intuition. This looks right or this doesn't look right. This feels right or it doesn't feel right. And so it's much, much harder for me to sit up here and explain to you how to create a good alternative grid layout. It's easier for me to show you some examples, but it's not something that can be as scripted as a traditional grid-based layout. So something like this on the right here, there isn't a real reason for how this line and that kink compare to this line and that kink. It just looks right. Right? There isn't necessarily a mathematical formula that defines what this grid is. It just feels pretty good. And so as you get better and better, you'll be able to do these kinds of things and have it work. So something like this in poster format, right? We don't have the traditional grid. There isn't really a column interval here. We have kind of this diagonal that's working its way through this way, which works. We have some kind of a diagonal that kind of goes back this way maybe, right? It's a very dynamic composition. It's different. It doesn't fit the basic mold. But my guess is for whoever came up with this particular poster, it took them iteration after iteration after iteration to get the one that was just right, with a lot of reliance on basic intuition of this feels right. These are some examples out of that layout workbook. So in this context, these are, again, very, very good examples of untraditional layouts, but it works really nicely. And she has some drawings about how she establishes this grid in the first place. And there's some similarity. This is one spread. This is the next spread. So you can see there's some kind of a column that's going in this direction. There's some kind of a column that's going in this direction. And they kind of reflect each other in multiple pages. So it's not just one grid layout for each page. It's some kind of an alternative grid that then works as the composition of the whole book. This diagonal here follows with this diagonal here. They're not exact, but there's just certain elements that appear the same such that these pages feel like they belong together. But again, very reliant on intuition. Grids are fantastic as a base, but just like in the world of architecture where, say, you have a column grid, an interval of columns, every once in a while, if you remove a column or you move a column off center, it can be a great place to start from, right, or to center around. And so we can do the same thing in graphic design where we have one piece that's out of place, and that then is the focus point that draws your attention in. So you purposely break it. Okay? If the grid, if you do it too often, if you break it too often, obviously the grid isn't right for you. But when you do break it, if you do it only occasionally, it can be a really powerful moment. So let's talk a little bit about the interaction of visual elements. So one of the big things that I'll hammer at you when you're working through this is establishing some kind of a hierarchy of visual elements. And this works in a typographic sense, certainly with how you start with your heading and your subheading and your sub-subheading and your body text and your footer text, right? And so you have established maybe a certain size ratio, a certain font ratio that works through, right? And it allows you to create a focal point. This is the strongest element, subordinate element below that, sub-sub element below that, and it's a natural way of progressing through a particular piece. So if we look, for example, at this drawing, right? Something is really bold. It's the gripping. It's the heading. From is a little bit lighter. Nothing is very, very light. It works through in a hierarchy. They're all the same size, but we work through kind of that hierarchy. Then we get exploring, whatever it is, exploring the juncture where material and concept meet, right? Subheading, smaller. So we understand the order with which we're supposed to be reading this particular visual set of elements. If a hierarchy is not established, you'll get overloaded, or somebody viewing this will get confused as to what's important and what's not important, or what order am I supposed to be reading it. So if we look at this particular poster, right, what's the thing that stands out first? Right? Some of you, it might be the flower. Okay? Some of you, it might be the text. And this is why I like to ask you the question, because it varies. Okay? In either case, it's directed to the top half of the page, not the bottom half of the page. Correct? Okay? So whether you're looking at the flower or you're looking at the text, you're immediately directed to the top half of the page. Now, if we look specifically at the text, ignore the flower for a second. Now that we're looking at the top half of the page, right, what does this tell us? What part stands out? Probably National Portfolio Day, because it's the white element and the other elements are yellow. So they've established where you're supposed to look first with the background image, and or if you ignore the background image, maybe the text directs you that way. You read it's National Portfolio Day. Okay, this gives me the most important piece of information. Good. Okay. Below that, I get the date and I get who's hosting it. They're kind of both at the same level of importance, right? It's going to be at California College of the Arts, and it's going to be on Saturday, January 19th, 2008. So those two are sub-National Portfolio Day in the order or in the hierarchy. Okay? Then, after we get past that, we start to trickle down into all the goodies that are down below. Okay? And then, obviously, you can't read it up here. I can't even read it on my screen. But the idea is that it's more information about what's actually happening in this National Portfolio Day or whatever. Right? So we're drawn in by that hierarchy in the first place. Okay? So let's look at this one. What stands out first? Right? Maybe it's the birds. Right? In this case, maybe the birds are a little bit distracting. Let's look at just the text. What stands out in the text? National Portfolio Day. Right? Kind of hits you over the head because everything else is a different color. So same concept here. If we look at just the text, oh, this is about National Portfolio Day. In this particular example, I'm not the biggest fan of the background. I think it's a little too dominant, and I don't think it directs your attention particularly well. But we know it's National Portfolio Day. Then we move to the yellow text. We know when it is and where it is. Right? Then we move into the sub-sub elements below that. So again, a nice strong hierarchy. So one of the things that I like to encourage you to think about, and this works when we're talking about the poster, which you're all designing, but it works really, really well if you're doing your final project posters for 220 or 221 or something like that, when you have your big boards and you have all your drawings and whatever. If you think in multiple scales as to how people are going to view your particular piece of work, it will help you a great deal. So what is somebody going to see when they look at your poster from 12 feet away? Right? And all too often we spend time designing on the computer, we're right up next to it and we see it in detail. And we forget to look at it from far away. So take a quick print of it, look at it from far away, 12 feet or so. What stands out? Are you directing people to the right thing? Okay? Then move a little bit closer at maybe 6 feet. What details come into view at 6 feet? What makes this poster interesting at 6 feet? Obviously, you can still see the same elements that you would see at 12 feet, but what adds to it when you get to 6 feet? What adds to it when you get to 3 feet away? Right? So we're slowly revealing more. Now, obviously, if you have super eyesight and you can see everything from 12 feet, congratulations, good for you. Right? Not everybody has that. If we get all the way into 1 foot, right, that's where you're right up next to a drawing, right, or a particular poster. What's revealed to you at that level of detail? Okay, and so let's adapt this again back to the architecture presentation. Right, you're doing your design project for 221 or 220 or whatever. Maybe it's even one of your museums for 121, though I don't think the drawings are emphasized as much in 121. But let's say, for example, you're doing one of your final projects, okay, and you're in a review, or you've watched people in a review. So the reviewers sit around, and we're all having a conversation about your particular work. We're generally sitting 6 to 12 feet away from your drawing. Okay? At some place during that presentation, you're talking, and you're totally nervous, and you're kind of like you're sweating, and you're like, what am I saying, and all that kind of stuff, right? And you're babbling. The people that are reviewing, right, might be doing this like, oh, please help me, I don't want to be here, right? But they might be engaged. They might be listening, and they might be looking. And then chances are one of them's going to stand up, and they're going to walk up to your drawing while you're still talking, and they're going to start staring at stuff about this far away, right? Anybody experienced this before? This is normal, right? So we're going to stare at it, and we're going to look at it. Right, and then maybe we'll move on to the model, and we'll start looking at the model, and then we'll do this to the model, etc. Right? That's part of the process. So we're looking at this 1 foot level of detail. So we viewed it in all of these scales. So if you, as the person who's presenting, think about the fact that people are going to view it from all these different scales, you can design the experience for them. What's the big idea? We see that from 12 feet. Right? What's kind of the sub-ideas? We see that from 6 feet. What's the detailed, really cool stuff of how the materials come together or the corner or whatever? That's that 1 foot level. So we want to be thinking about all those scales at once, and that's going to make a very, very successful presentation. When you establish the hierarchy in the first place, a lot of times you'll want to rank the visual elements by their importance. Right? So what's the number one most important thing that I'm going to try to get across to you? It's National Portfolio Day. I don't even know what National Portfolio Day is, but I'm using these as the example. You see I have a lot of posters from this, right? But it works because we can see contrasted different types of posters. Okay? So, most important thing in this context is it's National Portfolio Day. If I look at this poster, that kind of stands out. Right? Maybe it's a little hard to read, but that's the big thing. Once we move beyond that, when is it, those kinds of things, those sub-elements, if we were actually to create a list, a bullet point of what's most important, then what's next most important, right, we would get there. National Portfolio Day, number 1. Number 2, the date and time, right? Number 3, where it is, right? And we could keep working our way down. So that, by itself, helps us establish this hierarchy. So if you're doing the lecture series poster for your assignment 103, right, most important thing is probably going to be lecture series, right? Next most important thing is probably going to be who's speaking. Next most important thing, when are they speaking? Next most important thing, where are they speaking, right? Maybe when and where are at the same level. I don't know. But you get how I'm kind of establishing what's most important and working my way down. That's critical to this graphic design. You could come up with all of these. Let's talk about a few of them in specifics. Space provides visual contrast, right? Contributes to an effective ordering system, right? Empty space is as important as active content space. So if you have lots of dense elements all together, right, the space around them can help them come alive. If you don't have space around them, it's too dense and you get lost. Right? So you guys have probably talked about positive and negative space before in another class, maybe? Maybe in an art class in high school, maybe? Positive, negative space. So there's 2 ways of looking at space. This is where I wanted my stuff to show up. But anyway, you guys get it this way. Okay, so there's 2 ways at looking at space. Let's say I have a piece of paper that looks like this. And I have an element that's on the page. something like this. The active piece is this, right? The opposite of this, which would be the negative space, so again, same, roughly same, okay? The negative space is all of this. Okay? So we have positive content, and we have negative around it. Okay? Same thing happens if we had a more complex layout on these pages. Right? I have something like this. I'll draw it again. Okay? So obviously, active, active. Right? This piece here is negative space. Right? It's the lack of things. That can be just as important or as powerful as the active space. So you want to think about both of those together. The other thing is too much space can be detrimental. If I have the page like this, and I have a little element, the space is too much. Right? Very different than if I have the element that was like this on the page. The other thing is compositionally, if I put this element exactly in the center, not very exciting. Okay? If I put an element that's here, right, we get more space here, less space here, it starts to activate that page. So rather than centering the particular object, we move it off center, just like the rules of composition. You don't center the subject, you push them slightly off center, rule of third, etc. So it helps a great deal with how you navigate a particular scene. It directs you to the positive or visual areas of a particular piece. I like this example because I would argue that the most powerful piece of this is the fact that there's nothing right here. Right? We have this blank space with absolutely nothing right across that particular region. So that ends up, because everything else is so active, that ends up being the thing that you look at first. Right? That's what drives your eye here. And then you start to say, oh, okay, this is masterpieces, 15 masterworks by new masters from 8 states or whatever, and then you might look at whatever the elements are. So it's a very interesting play on the graphic design, where normally you'd be looking at the image first. In this context, you generally are looking at that blank space first. When we're using space, generally grouping elements together to provide a focal point and letting the space live around those objects is a good strategy. If you center the space, it deactivates. If you center something in the middle of a space, it deactivates the space around it. Right? If you have it off-center, this is exactly what I was talking about, it tends to activate the space around it. If you have too much space, like I said, it becomes ineffective. Right? It's kind of like having, anybody been to St. Peter's in Rome? One of you, thank you, right? Really, really big building, right? Like astronomically bigger than anything you can possibly fathom here. Okay? So like this room would be the size of a column in this building. I mean, we're talking massive building, okay? Ceiling heights of 400 feet, like big, real big, okay? So in that context, huge church, right? If you want to interact with that space, if you want to hold a mass there or something like that, right? It's too big. We're too small. If a room, if the column is the size of this room, how big do you feel in this room? Right? So if the Pope needs to present to an audience in that particular room, he's just tiny. Doesn't work from an architectural standpoint. So what did they do? Right? They made the baldacchino, which is a bronze sculpture that sits on the altar, that's a smaller room that he can stand in, that changes the scale of the building to be of a scale where you can actually understand what a person is, rather than, oh my God, the column's this big, and here's the little tiny person that doesn't mean anything. Okay? So you have to think about how you're using the space. Right? If it's too big, what do you do to make it small so that you can actually interact with it? Okay, I know that's a weird side example, but I think it's kind of relevant from an architectural standpoint. Scale is a great way of establishing hierarchy. Like I said in the typography lesson last class. Just changing the size of a font by itself can establish a hierarchy. You don't even have to change the font. You don't have to change the weight. Just the size can do it, right? 16 point, 12 point, 10 point, right? Some ratio of sizes. If you use it consistently, right? If the ratio is consistent and you use that all the way across the page, it will feel like it belongs together. Right? The worst thing that you can do is use different fonts, like, oh, on this page I'm going to use Times New Roman, and on this page I'm going to use Garamond. That doesn't work. You have to have consistency through it, and then as you go through pages, if your heading is always in capital letters and it's always at 20-point font, you have to make sure that that's consistent page after page after page. So you establish that across the whole body of work. Quantity is a big thing, but it's also a subjective thing. If you have too many visual elements, you get too much clutter on a particular page. If you have too few, it can be dull. And so what's the right amount of content? There's two ways to go about this. One is subtractive and one is additive. And it depends on how your brain works as to which one is the easier method. If you're using the subtractive method, you put everything that you have on the page. And you try to arrange it, and as it's too big, you delete it. Or if this is too much, I don't really need this, I delete it. Right? So you put everything on first, and then you pull away. And this is the right amount of content on the page. The other is, and I think it takes a more practiced set of skills to do it, is I put one element on the page, how do I like it? Maybe I'll add one more element and see if that's enough. Maybe I'll add one more, oh, too many, that's it. Right? So one way is you throw everything you have on it, and you pull away. The other is one at a time. Does it feel like enough? Does it feel like enough? Etc. Either way will get you to the same place, hopefully. But you have to think about which one is right for you and your personal design style. Neither one is right. Orientation and position can lead to very strong contrasts, and they can actually provide a focal point or enhance the hierarchy altogether. So, for example, you have everything is oriented horizontally, and then suddenly you throw in one vertical element. That vertical element is the big contrasting piece. Right? So in this context, when we look at this particular little poster, right, we have everything laid out very horizontal, right? The eyes and all the rest of it, and then all of a sudden we have her arm. Right? This provides a strong focal point. It also happens to be where all the text reverses. So we have text going forward and backward right from that one strong point that is the different point. So everything horizontal except for that one piece. Right? It breaks a little bit because of the swing set, but I think this is the strong focal point in this particular image. Depth, dimension, perspective is another strategy. We've kind of moved a little bit away from this as an overall strategy. It was really big like 2007 through about 2000, I forget what maybe 2012-ish, when Jonathan Ives and Apple changed the UI on all the Apple products to be flat, and it kind of went in a different direction. The trend went in the other direction. But it's still worth mentioning that depth or perspective, when you're laying things out, something is in front of something else, kind of leading to a three-dimensional presentation, that can establish the stuff that's important is more important, and the stuff that's behind is less important. And how you lay those out can do that. So something like this, the pieces of paper that are in the foreground become more important. The pieces of paper that are further in the background become less important. It still works as a graphic design concept, but it's a difference from the kind of traditional flat plane that we're used to designing in. Typography, we spent a whole lecture last class talking about type and fonts. Just because we moved past that lecture doesn't mean that it's not as important as the stuff I talked about today. Right? Type can make or break whatever you're doing. So what font you choose, what size it is, how that plays into the overall hierarchy can be very, very important. Right? Think macro and micro scales. The really big picture stuff and the small little details, the space between individual letters, the kerning, that kind of stuff matters. Color is also a big piece of graphic design. It's hard when I'm giving you these lectures because I can't cover everything in all the right order. Right? So in this context, we're getting graphic design stuff before we get to color. I'll get to color. I have a whole lecture on color theory and what colors mean and why you pick a certain color over another color. Unfortunately, I can't give you that before we do this. It just doesn't work in the flow of the class. So you have to wait for that one. But at the same time, color is a very important visual element to this graphic design process. So when you introduce a color, that can provide a contrast or a focal point. So it's definitely worth considering and being very careful about which color you pick and why. Graphic shapes and linear elements are used to support this hierarchy. One of the biggest problems, not so much in the poster but with the portfolios, is that all too often people get line happy or crosshair happy. And when I'm saying that, what I mean is that they take their poster or their layout pages, right? Let's say I'm doing it as a spread. There's my spread. There's my 2 pages. And OK, I have an image that's on this page, and I have another image that's on this page, and I have some text that's over here or whatever. And people say, oh, well, I'm going to frame that with some little pieces, something like this. And then before you know it, there's other lines, and there's more lines, and there's more lines, and there's more lines. And before you know it, these graphic elements, the lines and the crosshairs and the little shapes, dominate the photos. They're more important than the photos. In a portfolio, your work is the most important thing. So if your portfolio structure or layout is overcompensating or doing too much and not letting your work show through, that's the wrong idea. But in some cases, the little plus sign, right, focuses your attention on this particular little piece. That can be a good thing. So sometimes it's relevant, just don't overdo it. So in review, you as the designer of a graphic design piece need to create some kind of a hierarchy of importance and therefore reflect that hierarchy in your design strategy. Right? Could be in the type, could be in the visual elements, how large certain pictures are, how small they are. You want to order and control the design. You want to control the process through which people are viewing it, starting with the big ticket hierarchy down to the small stuff, 12, 6, 3, 1. Okay? Use contrast to establish a focal area. Everything's horizontal. I have one vertical element. That becomes my key point. A flow line is this exact thing. In that context, it's all the vertical columns. Flow line goes across horizontally. So it's that contrast. You want to use other compositional factors to support your design. Right? Make sure your images have good composition to them. Right? Make sure that you think about things like diagonals, radial compositions, depending on what you're trying to create, and how those play into this overall piece. Don't forget about rule of thirds. Right? Those all impact and can really help your graphic design. So here's some examples in kind of a portfolio book style that use a lot of the principles that we've talked about. And I'll flip through these rather quickly. But you see that at the top, we have kind of a strong flow line that's been established. The images and the color stops at that flow line. We have headings above it. We have a 4-column layout. In some instances, we're mimicking that 4-column layout by the way that these little pieces of text are showing up, but the image itself spans. As we flip to the next page in the book, again, consistent book, consistent design guidelines. Notice the flow line appears to be in the same place up at the very top. Right? This is kind of an isolated body of text, independent, but we still have the same kind of layout here with the columns and the image that goes across. Right? Similar here, that flow line drops down, but it follows across the page. The text lines up with this image. Right? So there's a relationship page to page here. Same thing, image lining up with that same flow line as we go page to page. Columns still following. There's that image again. So there's a certain consistency to how these come together and present an entire body of work. They're not, though, all the same layout. It's not the same programmatic thing that just has different pieces plugged into it. So there's variety in it. It's just carefully controlled variety. All right. So let's move over into the world of InDesign, and I'll show you a bunch of this stuff and how you establish these layouts. OK, so I'm going to go ahead and open up InDesign, and I'm going to show you a variety of strategies for how you go about laying out your grids and your columns, et cetera. And then I'll show you some strategies for how we bring in images, and we once we have this kind of grid-based structure, how do we make images span certain grid modules, etc. And kind of go through a variety of strategies for how that sort of works. So I'm going to start with a document, and I'm going to do this first as a spread. So I have 2 pages. You're going to be creating just a single little kind of 4x6 postcard. The reason that I picked the 4x6 postcard related to architecture is it's kind of a precursor to what you're going to be doing in the poster. So you can kind of collect your stuff for the poster and start thinking about it. It is not your poster. It is smaller than your poster. Your poster is a separate project, but this gets you thinking about that as content. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick a half of a letter sheet. I'm going to leave it facing pages. I'm going to set my margins to 0. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And when I do that, I have a single page that would be my cover. I'm going to move forward into 2 pages that are side by side as a spread, so pages 2 and 3. I just clicked on the New Page button under the Pages window. It's right there. And that creates pages 2 and pages 3, or page 2 and page 3, which I can then see here. So now it's a matter of starting to establish that basic grid layout. And I'll use the one that I showed in lecture a little bit ago, and I should be able to pull it up so that you can see it. Let's see if I can pull it up here. This is what happens when you switch computers, right? All right. I hope it's in here. This might be an old version. Of course it's the old version, right? Nope, it's not here. All right, well, my bad. Anyway, we'll do it. I'll show you it live instead of showing you the live example. So a couple things. One, when I start to work on this, the stuff that I create, I want to not end up being a printable layer. I just want it to be some guides for me. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on the Layers window. And when I click on the Layers window, we haven't dealt too much with layers in InDesign just yet. We'll deal with layers a little bit more in InDesign, but we'll also really get into layers with Illustrator. The layers work the same in Illustrator as they do in InDesign. The layers work different in those 2 products than they do in Photoshop. So it's a little bit different in terms of how they're structured. But the fundamentals are essentially the same in that layers that are on top of other layers, the layers that are on top show up on top of the layers that are below. So right now I only have 1 layer. I'd like to add 1 more layer, so I'm going to click on the New Layer button down here at the bottom. And when I click on that, you see that now I have layer 1 and I have layer 2. And I can choose which one I'm working on by just clicking on it, and it'll highlight in blue. Now, I'm going to rename layer 2 here, and I do that by double-clicking on it, and I'm going to call this Guides. And if we look at the layer options, there's a checkbox for Print Layer. Well, I don't want this to print ultimately, so I'm going to uncheck the Print Layer, and I'll say OK, which means that anything I draw on this layer will not print, will not export to a JPEG. So it's just something that's used as a reference for me, which is a big advantage in the layer structure. So with Guides highlighted, and I could actually drag it below layer 1 if I wanted to, with Guides highlighted, I can then draw on this screen, and whatever shows up won't be printed or won't be exported. So I'm going to go ahead and change my units first into inches. Perfect. And then I'm going to go ahead and start with the basic line tool over here on the left side. Now when I click on the line tool, I want to confirm what color I'm drawing in. So right now my stroke color, or my line color, is black. Let's go ahead and change that to be, say, red, so that I can see it. And now that it's red, I'm going to go ahead and draw from this bottom corner up to right there, where the 2 pages meet. And then I'll draw from this corner again down to the lower corner, right there. So I've drawn this little triangle. After I have that triangle drawn, I'm going to draw again a line that goes from this corner all the way to the upper corner right there, and a line that goes from this corner down to the lower corner right here. Okay? So I'm starting to establish some guides of what represents my particular page. And I'm going to use those as part of this layout. So the next thing is I'm going to set up some basic horizontal and vertical guides to start to establish what is my active area of this particular page going to be. So I'm going to click over here on the ruler, and I'm going to drag over a guide. And you see it kind of shows up. Now if I hold down Shift, it will actually jump to my ruler marks. So in this case, I can have it jump right here to a ½ inch away from the seam between these two pages, between the spread. So we'll go right there at 6. And once again, I'll drag across, and we'll go right there at 5. So I'm a ½ inch away. Okay? Now, I should point out that when I drag, if I drag my guide and I am above the page or on the outside of the page, I get a continuous infinite line that goes beyond the page itself. If, however, I drag my guide and I'm inside the page, I get a line that doesn't go past the page. So the guideline stops at the page. Depends on which one you find more comfortable or which one you want to work with. So now I have those two guides established. Now I'm going to drag a line down such that it intersects. And I'm going to, again, instead of being on a single page, I'm going to be outside. And I want it to go to right where those intersect. So right where those two intersect right there. Can you guys even see the guides? They're really faint, right? Let's see if I can change them. Let's see if I can change the color. No, I'm not quite sure where I change them, so bear with me for a second. I don't know where I changed it. I'll have to look that up. I apologize that it's so difficult for you guys to see on the page. Okay, so I have those established there. I have a line that goes across here. I'm going to create the outside of my pieces there and there. Okay, so there's the outside of my content area. And then I'll also drag down to the very bottom here to make the bottom of my little content area. So what I have now, if I were to use a rectangle, is I have an active content area that is right there. Okay? I have the mirror of it on this page that is right there. Okay? So in this context, that's where I'm going to place content. Okay? I'd like to divide this up a little bit more so that I have two columns. But instead of just dividing these two columns evenly, I'm going to use that ratio, that 0.618 number, to figure out how long or what the division of these two columns should be. So in this case, I have a column that goes, or this active area of the page is at 4 inches. So if I brought up a calculator, and I said 4 times 0.618, I get 2.472. So almost 2.5 inches. Okay? So I'm going to draw a line that's even with this guide that goes in this direction. Now, I could slide this out until I get 2.47 inches. You see how in that little gray box I can see what the value is? I'm holding down Shift to keep it perfectly horizontal. And now I have a line that goes to 2.417. Or 2.47, and then I can drag a guide over to where the end of that line would be. And based on that golden section, I now have 2 columns established on this particular page. It would be nice if I gave a little bit of a space between those two columns, right? So maybe I'll add a little bit of space. Something like that. And now I have a division between those two columns. So where I had one column, I can now create essentially two columns. So I can have a column that is here and a column that is right there. And these two are going to work nicely together. And maybe those are confusing to see them that way. Hold on. Let me do a square, and I'll fill them so that you can see it a little bit better. I have one piece of content that's there and one piece of content that's there. So you see they now have a relationship between one another, which is nice. Okay? So I can do the same thing on the opposite side. Line, we'll start here and we'll go to 2.47. There it is. I can draw a line going down, and then once again I can give myself a little bit of space around it. About like that. And then I could once again create these same two little active regions on this page. Like that. Okay? So you see I'm creating this as these are regions that I can then work within. So let me go ahead and flip those back so that they're outlines rather than, I'm just holding down Shift to select all three, and I'm flipping them back to be just outlines. Okay? So now it would be nice to not only have this established, but to create a nice natural flow line that would go across to divide a heading from the body of this particular page. So I'm going to drag a guide down to where it intersects those two lines. And then I'm going to split the difference between these two lines with a third line. And I'm just going to do this visually right about there. And then I can actually go back and I can delete this first line. So this guide then can divide my active content into an upper title or something and a lower title. So now that I have all of this kind of established as a basic layout technique, remember anything that I drew on this guides layer won't print. I can actually go ahead and lock the guides layer altogether so that I can't actually accidentally select anything. And then I can start to work with this as an actual page. Let me go to layer 1, and then I'll go ahead and start to create stuff. So let's say that I need a title. I'll let the title span both columns here. And so maybe this says DVC architecture. I can change the font to be whatever seems appropriate. And then I can also change the size. So we'll go up until it spans both. Right, that's a horrible font. Right, maybe we'll do that. Okay. So I now have that. It says DVC architecture. If I then wanted a column that was about the program, I might use a text column that was here. And because I don't want to actually have to write anything, I'm going to go and look for the DVC architecture.com website. And then we can come over here and we can find, I don't know, let's see here, mission statement. There we go. We're going to copy this text. And we're going to come back and we're going to paste it right into there. I could save it as a Word file and place it, but it's not a particularly large amount of text, so I'm comfortable just copying and pasting it into a text box. And so we have this as a single column, and then maybe I'll add a little image file, something like this. And I can go to File and then Place, and I could drop an image file related to architecture into that particular field. So I'm going to go ahead and drop on my flash drive here and pick one of those images that I've used before from the album cover, just to put something in it. And then I'll right-click, go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, Oops, that was not the right option. Fill frame proportionally. And now I have a little image. So I have this kind of established. I have this. Maybe this is a horrendously awful font. And once again, I have to, let's go back to like Arial. And maybe I'll do this. So here, I'm not quite all the way. Because I'm not quite all the way, maybe I'll justify to make sure that I fit all the way to that edge. And then maybe I'll create a sub-headline below this. I just copied and pasted. And we'll call this Architecture Program. Right? A little bit too much squeezing going on. Let's drop this down. And I'm going to go back to a centered or maybe a left justified, something like that. Right? So I'm establishing hierarchy there. I have a nice flow that runs across this particular page. If I go up to View, Screen Mode, Preview, it will strip everything away so that all I'm seeing is a preview of what my page ultimately will look like. So again, I have a nice flow line across here. Let's go ahead and continue with the multi-page layout for right now. I'm going to go back to View, Screen Mode, Normal. Gets me all my lines back. And this time, I'm going to add an image that's here. And I'll go to File and then Place. I need another image. Right-click, Fitting. Fill frame proportionally. There it is. Okay. So let's say that I have this image. Right? Yeah. Let's say I have this image. I'm just going to go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste to have a second version of this image. And then I'm going to go to Edit, Copy, and Edit, Paste to have one more image. Okay. So I would like for this image, oops, that was not what I wanted. I would like for this lower image here to end up right at the bottom of my layout. For some reason, I think that size got adjusted there. Okay, I want it to be at the bottom. I want this image to be at the top, and I'd like this third image to fall in between these two images. Okay, so I could visually try to align the two and say, oh, that looks like it's about right. But I can also use something that's called the Align tools. So we were in typography mode. I'm going to switch to be in advanced mode for now. And it doesn't appear that it's available to me. So I'm going to go up to the Window menu, Object and Layout, and click on Align. Oh, it did show up here. Align. It's a little floating palette right here. And so the Align tools will let me do several things. So I've already established kind of this basic layout of elements anyway. But if, for example, I wanted all three of these to line up, let's say I've dropped this image in and it was slightly off center, and I dropped this image in and it was slightly off center. I can select, holding down Shift, all three of these images. And this mouse is clicking funny. Hold on a second. There we go. I'll select all three of those images, and then in the Align tool, I can align to the left edge, align to the right edge. But in order to do that, I need to establish what's called the key object. And I do that by just clicking one more time on a single object. And it kind of highlights that one object in blue. That's the object that's going to stay in position. And the other objects are going to align to it. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, I want them to align to the right edge. So I'll click on right edge. And you see that it moves all the objects so that they all line up right along that right edge, which is ideal. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to deselect, and I'm going to move this one down because I manually want it to be at the bottom there. Move it at the bottom. But now I want the spacing between these three objects to be even. So let me take... No, stop. There. There. And there. All right, I think I have them all. And if I look here, I've got an option for distribute spacing. I'm going to uncheck the use of specific spacing, and then I'll click on the distribute spacing. And what that will do is it will move the center object, assuming that I had it selected, which I've been struggling with. For some reason, my mouse is not working for me here. There we go. I have all three selected. If I click on distribute spacing, it will move the center object to be in between the two outer objects. And I'll do some more examples on another page in just a second so that you can see this happen. Okay. The other thing that I could do is I could say I want to use a specific spacing. I want them to be 1/8 of an inch apart. I can pick this as my key object and then say distribute spacing, and it'll put 1/8 of an inch in between each of these images. Right? So I have a lot of flexibility in how that lays out. Let me go ahead and add a little bit more text. We'll put a little text box in here, and we'll align to the right. We'll say that this is an Arial, and we'll make it 10 point. And maybe I'll say that this is, oops, this is Dylan BH, and maybe I'll add in like 7 point that this was whatever the date of the photo was. Something like that, which apparently I can't type today either. So let's say I took it, I completely made this up. I have no idea when I took the photo. But let's say that it was January 28th. Come on, there we go. And let's make this font, and again, I'm establishing hierarchy here. Let's make that down to like 6 point. And I now have that there. Maybe I want to copy this, and I want it to come down here, but I want this to line up with the top of this image. So I can hold down Shift to select both of these images, select this image as the key object, and then align to the top. And now I know that those are even. We can take this, copy, paste, and we'll drop it down here a little bit lower. Now, there are something called smart guides in InDesign that will give you little green lines to help you line things up. So I can really just drag this in place, and it will line it up for me. Yeah, it's kind of like smart tracking in Rhino or AutoCAD. But I want you to be aware that this align toolbox is available to us as well. So there it is. And maybe these are different dates. This is the 25th, and this is February 29th or whatever. Okay. I picked it because we had leap year this year. So now that I have that, if I press Control-0 and I have my layout so that we can see the whole set of pages here, remember, if I wanted to see this without all the jumbled lines and whatever, I can go up to the View menu. I can go to Screen Mode and then Preview, and we can see that now I have something that's laid out where I have a strong horizontal flow line. I have a title that's above. I have text. This text is probably too big and it's the wrong font. I can put a little image in, maybe a little bit of text below that, but I have established a basic format through which I can continue with my design process. Now, if I were continuing with more pages of this, maybe I'd duplicate the spread to keep the same basic layout with the same tools on it. And let's say that I wanted one of these images to span across and over to here. Let me turn back on my normal mode, and let me take this frame, and I'm going to say, no, I wanted it to go all the way across both pieces of text. Let me right-click, go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and then maybe I'll delete this. Maybe I'll leave that one in its place. That needs to go away. That needs to go away as well. And maybe I'll rename this, or maybe I'll move this and this over to here. And maybe we'll call this Sunset. I cannot type today. So I'm working within the same context here where I have something like that, but this now spans across those two frames. If I go into View, and then I go to screen mode preview, we can see that I'm working within the same context. Maybe I have a couple more pieces here. It's the same flow line as this page. It's just laid out a little bit differently on this page. So the point is that we have a lot of flexibility by establishing this across multiple pages. So maybe this is a bit premature in doing multiple pages. Let's go back to a single page. I'll go to File, New, Document. We're going to do it as a 4 by 6 card. So I'm going to say 4 inches by 6 inches. And then I'll go ahead and say OK, which gives me this little layout. Oops, I meant to change the margins. Let me go to Layout. Or excuse me. It changes on a Mac. Document Setup. And we're going to make sure that the margins, oops, no, it's under Layout, Margins and Columns. And we're going to set these at 0. There we go. And so now I need to start laying out this particular little card. Okay, I could use the same strategy for how I divide it up and what have you. But I'm going to do it as if it were by scratch a little bit. And I'm going to start by creating some frames. So we'll start with a frame. And let's say that I want a frame, and I want to specify an actual dimension for it. So let me right-click and go into inches so that we can work with inches. I know that overall my width is 4 inches. Okay, so if I wanted, maybe 3 images across, we'll do them maybe at 1.5 inches each. If I know that I want 1.5 inches image, instead of trying to drag and then make it and find 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches or whatever, I can instead just single-click, and then I can specify a value. So maybe let's do 1.25 instead. 1.25. Can't or do it. Say OK. And that gives me a 1.25 by 1.25 square. Delete this. There it is. I'm going to use this a couple times. So let me press Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. There's the second version. We'll drag it up. Control-V, there's my third version, something like that. So I have those 3 versions. Again, I want to control the spacing between these 3. So I'll select all 3 at once. I'm going to use spacing of 1/8 of an inch so that they are all exactly 1/8 of an inch apart. And then let's see if we can make it fit on the page. So now, at 1.25, I get 1.25 by 1.25, same times 3, with 2 column intervals there and there. Okay? So I have those. Let me go ahead and take those, and I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to paste them. And I have another set, something like that. I want to, again, distribute. So I'll take these 2, pick that as the key object, use 1/8 of an inch as spacing between them. Now I could take these 3, use this one as the key object, and align them all to the top. Now I have that set. Same thing, Control-C, Control-V to get a third set. Those 2, this is the key object, distribute at 1/8. Those 3, that's the key object, distribute to the top. So you see how I'm quickly creating this modular grid. Okay? Maybe I'll do one more set, Control-C, Control-V. And this one I ultimately want to be at the very bottom of the page, like that. So now maybe I'll use this as the key object, and I'll redistribute so that they're 1/8, 1/8, 1/8, with a little bit more space at the top. And then I can, again, select with this as the key object and align to the bottom. Align to the bottom. And align to the bottom. So now I have all of these frames established. They all have 1/8 of an inch between them. I have essentially a 3-column grid. I can then start to think of this as an overall layout. And this is, again, a much more structured approach to how I'm creating this. But I can do a couple different things. I can start to place individual images. Let's get some architecture images. Go search creativecommons.org. All right, so let's do architecture San Francisco. do it more local. Right? And so let me just, I'll pick a couple pieces, a few images. And then I'll save those. That's too grainy. Okay, this one's kind of fun. Download that and move it to my flash drive. New folder, exercise 111. And let's paste it. And then we can get a few other ones. That one's a pretty good one. Good. And let's see. Sure, why not? One more. We'll use this one too. Yeah, okay. All right, sorry, just trying to get a few images here. All right, so now I could place them into individual frames. So I can go to File and then Place, and I can drop these. I can say drop this one, and I can drop one to here. One. I could go place, and I could drop, say, this one. Okay. So I've dropped them in. If I right-click and I go to Fitting and Fill Frame Proportionally, I could have a bunch of individual little images that would represent, architecture in San Francisco or something like that. So again, going through, fill frame proportionally. But where this starts to be powerful is, what if instead of using one of these images in one context, what if I started to span frames, right? What if I had some information about the architecture program and it went right here spanning these two frames? So instead of these 4 frames, maybe I would replace that with a text box that went across those 4. And I'm just putting something in so I can hold it temporarily. And let me deselect the text box, and then I can delete the frames, and now I have just the text box here. So I could come back and borrow the text from the architecture program, something like this. And I could place that right here. I'm just going to paste it in. And maybe the font isn't right. Maybe let's go to Arial. And maybe it needs to be like 8 point. So it gets a little bit smaller. Anyway, it doesn't quite fit, so maybe I need to adjust it a little bit. And I can have these little images that then span around. But what happens if I wanted one of these images to then take up more space, right? So it would be very easy to just adjust the size of this image to go across all 3. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And so that could then be the whole bottom of the page, like that. But what if instead of doing it like that, I wanted to, say, have one image span multiple frames but keep the gaps between them? Okay, so let's say instead that I wanted this image of the bridge to take up all 6, right, of these individual little frames. So let me go ahead and get rid of this one for a second, and I'm going to do this as a brand new set of images. Okay, so I'm going to take this, and this, and I'm holding down Shift, this frame, and this frame. And once I have all of those selected, I'm going to go up to the Object menu, and I'm going to go to Paths, Make Compound Path. It's also Control-8 is the shortcut. And when I do that, you're going to see that what used to be a bunch of individual little x's is now a set of squares that have one big X that goes between them. So now, if I went and selected this and said File, Place, and pick that image of the Golden Gate Bridge, it spans across all of those little squares. So I can right-click and I can go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and that then is spanning across that grouping of squares. So I can do that if I want. I can do the same thing up here or down here. It doesn't have to be just a square, right? It can span across. So this may be something that you want to do. It may not be something that you want to do. Maybe I pushed that too far. We'll go back to where they were. Maybe I just want the bottom three. Again, I'll go up to Layout, or excuse me, Object, Paths, Make Compound Path. It becomes one image, and then I can go to File, Place, and maybe we'll place that in. Right-click and go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Oops. Sorry, wrong thing selected. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Now we have that at the bottom. Now maybe this image here needed to span multiple frames. So let me take this, this, and this, and I'm going to go to Object, Paths, Make Compound Path. It now is all three of those. And if I right-click and I go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, that image will now span all three of those. So the point is, it doesn't have to be just a square or a rectangle. I can do anything that I want. And then I could also place an additional image over here, depending on the look that I was going for. Obviously, I could put the title up here, etc. Okay? So let's see. What else might you want to do? Maybe you want to, say, make the title an image. So let me go ahead and add something for the title. We'll call this DVC Architecture. Did I spell it right? Yeah. And let's change the font to be something a little bit thicker. That's horrible. I know my fonts on my system much better than I know fonts that are here. That one won't show up very well. All right, let's try that one. Yeah, you're not going to see it well enough. I need something a little bit thicker. Okay, so pretend that this was actually attractive. Okay. And so let's say that I have the whole word there, okay, and I want to take one of these images and place it inside of that text, right? Just like I've done with the frames. I can take the text and I can go up to Type, and I can choose this option for Create Outlines. Now, when I do this and I create the outlines, this is no longer an editable piece of text. So I can't go back and if I spelled something wrong, I can't change the spelling. But when I say Create Outlines, it then creates an object of these individual letters. Once I have that object, I can go to File and then Place, and I could pick any image that I wanted and say Open. And it will then fill that particular text, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, with whatever that image is. Okay, so any object that you can create, you can fill with a particular font or page, excuse me, a particular image. So let's say instead I really wanted something custom, and I wanted to do one of those kind of diagonal layouts, trusting my intuition. I could actually draw an object, and I'm using the pen tool to draw that object. We'll cover the pen tool in more detail, but I can use that as an object that I can place to. So I can go to File and then Place, and I could place this, say, into that object, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and now that shows up in that particular piece. It does have a little border around it, so I would need to make sure that the border is transparent in this context. But the point is that I can do basically any shape I could create, I could place an object into, and that's what I wanted to be able to tell you. I can do that with text as well, so I could create the shape for the text. Something like that, and I could then make that an active set of text. Let me go ahead and jump back here and copy this. And now the text can follow into that particular piece as well. It has a border around it, so once again, I'll get rid of the border like that. And now if we went into preview mode, so let me go into my view screen mode preview, right? We could see that I've changed the layout with that diagonal. So my point is, I just wanted to at least tell you that that's available. If you're struggling with how to do it, I'll help you come up with the strategy. I'd like for you to be able to play around today and create these kinds of spanning frames using the compound path. But ultimately, I want you to concentrate on create a nice, good, solid precursor to your poster. So this is the experimentation phase for your actual poster. Make sense? All right.